Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for today, hosted by the Global Law and Policy Initiative for the Americas, the Houston Journal of International Law, as well as the University of Bologna Center for Latin American Studies. I am Elizabeth Trujillo. I'm professor of law at the University of Houston Law Center and the director of the Global Law and Policy Initiative for the Americas. Welcome to our roundtable today, this morning, on global challenges, local solutions, supply chain sustainability, and governance. I'm really excited about hosting this event with the Houston Journal of International Law and the University of Bologna on these cutting-edge topics concerning us today as we enter the third year of the global pandemic and hopefully approaching a new endemic phase of addressing this virus. We as a global community and as a country have faced many new challenges in dealing with the pandemic. There are many lessons to be learned around global health, but also for the future challenges that have global reach, and where solving those challenges require local solutions as well as global strategies. So for this reason, GLAPA has focused or wanted to embark on this research from the lessons we can learn from the global pandemic for global governance and the international law. So that we may better understand how to deal with future challenges like climate change, like commerce and trade, human rights, and social justice. Now, we have to say that much has happened between last year and this year. This is a follow-up webinar from the webinar, the 6-part series that we did last year on constitutionalism, trade, social justice, and sustainability in the Americas, lessons from the 2020 global pandemic. Clearly, our minds right now are with the Ukrainian people and the terrible crisis that is happening in Europe at the moment. But we also see that there are many challenges that we're still dealing with respect to the global pandemic and what we can learn in terms of economic strategies that can be used as levers to address global challenges, the governance frameworks that need to be changed and adjusted to better comport with local strategies as well as global ones. So many of the themes that were covered last year had to do with the lessons from the global pandemic on social justice, international law, health, climate change, human rights, and trade. Some of the conclusions were that we needed more equitable access to healthcare and vaccines. What were the best ways to enhance this access, including the role of trade and legal frameworks, both internationally and domestically, the need for reconfiguring economic strategies to provide wider access that better comport with climate and technological needs for the future, and reimagining the role of the domestic and international institutions in dealing with global emergencies, as well as regional strategies for combating the pandemic. So today's webinar consists of two really fascinating roundtables with wonderful speakers that will focus on two main key areas that we thought needed a little bit more discussion around some of the global challenges around the pandemic. One was the impact that global disruption may have on the global economy and the ways in which economic levers can be useful in reaching solutions that span the globe. For this reason, the first roundtable will focus on this intersection of trade, supply chain management, climate change, and health, and the important ways that these areas relate to one another for things like vaccine distributions, decarbonization strategies, global access to tools to overcome the challenges we face. The second roundtable, which will be chaired by my collaborator, Professor Sabrina Ragone, will consider the comparative governance models in dealing with global challenges and their connection to international law. The speakers will focus and discuss on local examples of what these frameworks may look like and their rate of success in managing the pandemic and other future global challenges. But before I continue, I would like to thank my collaborator, Professor Sabrina Ragone, who has worked hard with me in the last year and 2 years on putting together this webinar series and this research project. She is the Associate Professor of Comparative Public Law of the Department of Political Science and Social Sciences at the University of Bologna, and she holds the post of Coordinator for International Relations. I also want to thank the Houston Journal of International Law, who has so graciously agreed to publish a symposium issue that will publish the papers and the presentations from today's webinar, as well as from last year's webinar series. I will introduce the editor-in-chief, Nate Green, who is a 3L, and after graduating this spring, will be practicing patent law with Norton Rose Fulbright in their Houston office. Congratulations, Nate, on that position, as well as Brian Kay, who is the alumni and events editor of the Houston Journal of International Law. And after graduation, he will work for Reed Smith's Houston office in the Global Commercial Disputes Litigation Practice Group. So congratulations to you as well, Brian. So with no further ado, I want to pass the baton to Nate, who would like to also welcome all of you.
Thank you, Professor Trujillo. Just wanted to give a brief introduction to the journal. The Houston Journal of International Law publishes legal academic articles touching any and all areas of international law. And we're honored to co-host this event and to publish articles stemming from the research today. So please be on the lookout for those articles in the coming year. And as a group focused on international law, we would also be remiss to not acknowledge the situation happening in Ukraine. We unequivocally stand with the people of Ukraine and hope that a resolution to the war can occur soon. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming today.
Thank you, Nate. I think we lost him a little bit there. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Nate, very much. And I will also introduce Brian Kay. Maybe you could just say hello, Brian, our alumni and events editor. He will be basically running the Q&A today. I think he's also fixing some technological issues, so we will come back to Brian at the Q&A time. So I do want to go ahead and move on to our first roundtable, but I want to also mention a little bit the format. We will allow each speaker of each roundtable to speak for about 8 to 10, 12 minutes to present some of the updates on their research on these topics. And then we will have a few questions for them to facilitate some exchange and discussion on the panel. And the students as well will pose some questions and facilitate that discussion. And then we will open it up for the last 15 minutes to the audience. So please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A chat format at the bottom of your webinar page. And we will do our best to address those questions at the end of each roundtable. The second roundtable will allow a little more time for questions. So that way, if you have questions that relate to both roundtables, we can address those as well. There will be a 15-minute break between 10:30 and 10:45. Please do not log off. We will just be back online. Do not log off. We will be back to the webinar at 10:45 for the second roundtable. So the first roundtable on supply chains and trade and climate change and health. We have a really wonderful cast of speakers. Our first speaker will be Gabrielle Marceau, who is the senior counselor in the research division of the WTO Secretariat since May 2020. She also is a professor at the University of Geneva and has worked obviously in trade and trade research for many, many, many years. All of us in the trade field know Gabrielle Marceau and appreciate her contribution to the field. Our second speaker will be Professor Dan Farber, the Sho Saito Professor of Law and the Faculty Director of the Center for Law and Energy and Environment at the University of California, Berkeley. He serves on the editorial board for the Foundation Press. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a life member of American Law Institute. He's a leading scholar in the area of constitutional law and climate change and environmental law, and we're very grateful for him to be here today. And he will be speaking on two crises, COVID-19 and climate change. Our third participant, Professor Kish Perella, is Professor of Law at Washington and Lee University School of Law, where she teaches and researches in corporate compliance, contracts, corporate social responsibility, and international business transactions. She's published in several leading journals. She is a member of the board of directors for Global Business and Human Rights Scholar Association, a member of the editorial board for Business and Human Rights Journal, and she is also the chair of the annual meeting for the ASOL conference this year. So her plate is quite full, and I really do appreciate her taking the time today to speak to us on her expertise in the supply chain management arena. Pedro Villarreal is a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, and he conducts research on international comparative health law, as well as intersections with international economic law. And his book on pandemics in the law, a governance perspective, was awarded the prize for the best doctoral dissertation in law and social sciences. So I will pass the baton first to Professor Marceau. Thank you for being here, and you may start.
Good afternoon from Geneva, the WTO. Good morning to you. Good night for some of you, and thank you to Elizabeth and Sabrina for inviting me. Of course, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and I have a short PowerPoint, and I'm glad that this second sort of a session is really a continuation of the last year's presentation. And I would say that the role of the WTO has continued to evolve from what I presented last year. So you see well the PowerPoint? Did I share it properly? Okay.
Yes.
So, of course, unequal vaccine distribution is a fact. You're all informed and aware, so I won't spend too much time on the statistics, and the regions well distributed and not so well distributed are also well known. And this is where we start talking about vaccine protectionism, where countries protect their own people. Arguably, some students have suggested to me in class that this is normal. It's democracy where governments protect their own people, but it remains a sensitive issue, the equal distribution, because as it was said, and as we said last year, until everyone is vaccinated, there's a risk even for a rich country. Another more recent problem, and we'll look at what WTO deals and does with it, it's the problem of vaccine expiry and the fact that rich countries have, for protection reason, ordered boosters, for instance, and they don't use them. They want to pass them, but they pass them and donate them a bit late. And those vaccines arrive in developing countries that have a weaker logistic distribution sort of system. So there are problems. And of course, they expire. And there's a few statistics on this slides. Now, why is vaccine inequity a debate in the WTO, and why has the WTO become so central in this vaccine sort of issue? It's because essentially vaccines, their input, related material and services relating to vaccine production are all goods and services, many of which need to cross the border. Therefore, there's a trade issue. And because WTO deals with that, and because we realize transparency is basic, the WTO indeed became central to the debate about vaccine distribution and related issue. This is also comprehensible for those who know trade a little bit, because there are a lot of basic rules that became obviously important in the first weeks of the pandemic when Kazakhstan blocked exportations of agriculture products because they worried to not have enough food or masks or respirators. And all these actions that were done spontaneously by governments touch upon basic GATT issue. Same with intellectual property. Early on, India and South Africa asked that patent rights and copyrights and other rights on vaccines be set aside so governments of poor country can copy medicines. Subsidies, the money given to companies to help them cope. TBT in countries like Canada, one of the first things that was done where usually labels of products must be translated, Canada said, well, let's forget translation for now. So these are all actions that spontaneously government took without thinking of WTO, and they quickly realized this is all related to WTO, to trade. So early on in March 2020, DG Azevedo at the time urged all countries to benefit and make use of the TPR process of the WTO. The expert there used to receive information, simplify, analyze, and indeed, the governments repeated a bit the experience they had done under DG Lamy in 2008, using the WTO as a forum to understand and find out what each other does. And in that context, the Secretariat helped countries notify. So in the TPR on COVID, there is no formal notification as such, but just transmission of information. Then came DG Ngozi. Herself, she used to be president of Gavi, so a terrible expertise in the area of vaccine. And she made use of that. She was at the time also named one of the most influential person, and she did use all her power for accelerating vaccine distribution and shifting the boat of the WTO towards vaccine. She created, or with others, of course, this new sort of collaboration, IMF, World Bank, WHO, and TO on vaccine. And this is a group at the top head levels, middle level, and technical level. That is a group where they look at practical things such as where should we set up, where should new production facilities be set up, and of course now the problem of supply chain. There are also other associations that you're aware of, and the DGs in particular are focusing on technical assistance for countries, not about what does TRIPS or WTO say, but really practical things. The WTO and IMF has set up a new sort of vaccine tracker that seems to be the vaccine tracker, although there are many, but you see the change in the, what I call the new role of the WTO, where some of my colleagues are plunging into vaccine and supply chain issue, of which I'll say one word, because soon we realize that we cannot deal with the issue of vaccine distribution without looking at supply chain. Another issue that is debated in WTO, although it's intellectual property, it could be at WIPO, but it was brought here. And at the moment, just to report, there are ongoing, almost daily negotiations between Australia, India, Japan, and US trade ministers with the DG and DDG Annabel Gonzalez, trying to find a solution to this request for a waiver that has become a component of any solution, even for the next ministerial. Now, 2 words on other vaccines initiatives. Of course, other colleagues can talk about it more importantly and more with better experience. But one point that is crucial and has become obvious, and I'm glad that somebody more quite experienced will talk about it, it's the issue of supply chain. And supply chain, as you know, involve decisions by companies, sometimes even governments, as to where to produce what, but also issues concerning investment, competition, and these are sort of issues directly involving the private sector. And that's something that DG Ngozi did that is a bit of a revolution here. The first week she arrived, she was mandated by a group of countries, Canada and others, to initiate talks with suppliers of vaccine, producers, manufacturers, bringing them closer to themselves, to each other, to governments, to IGOs. And we have had meetings of the sort here in the WTO since she arrived, trying to push again the problem of vaccine. Quite new for the WTO, who traditionally rejected the Singapore issues, who traditionally refused that companies get close to the building because it's a government to government. But now that basically the main financial institutions have asked the WTO to take over this thing on supply chain that involve many partners, we have on the 21st, in 10 days, the first big conference involving all sorts of stakeholders, more practical, about supply chain. But I can confirm, and I'll finish with this, some of my colleagues in the Secretariat now are really dealing with practical business issue of supply chain, being in contact, contacting or being contacted by X company as to where is your problem, about what else could be used to replace the situation, etc. So definitely a new role for the WTO trying to cope with this extraordinary situation. I will stop here and thank you again for having involvement.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle, for that fascinating presentation on the new role of the WTO. I will move on to the next presentation, which is by Professor Farber on two crises, COVID-19 and climate change. Professor Farber, thank you.
I have also have a few slides. COVID and climate change are obviously very different, but what they have in common is that both of them are global in scope, and both of them require an urgent response. So I'll start by talking about the impact of COVID itself and of recovery measures on carbon emissions, and then I'm going to talk about some of the governance issues that have arisen that I think, where I think there are some similarities, as well as at least one interesting difference. The graph at the top of the page shows what happened to oil in the early days of the pandemic. And you'll notice that there's a brief period in which the price of oil in some markets actually went negative. Suppliers were paying to have buyers take the oil off their hand. Obviously, today we're in a very different situation, not only a couple of years later. So here, what you can see is the immediate impact of COVID on carbon emissions. And what you see is a big dip in early 2020. And then even by the summer of 2020, we start to see a recovery with China recovering the most rapidly. And what we can see now that was less clear during the previous meeting is that emissions have more or less returned to trend, maybe slightly above trend. Now, we don't know really whether that will continue, even putting aside the current, whatever impact there might be from the Ukraine situation and sanctions. I think it seems likely that there will be perhaps some movement below trend due to the increasing use of remote work and remote meetings like this one. So I wouldn't be terribly surprised if after the sort of economic bounce back, we got actually a little bit below the previous trend line, but we really don't know at this point. But any thought that the reduction in emissions early in the pandemic was heralding something, a major shift, has pretty much evaporated at this point. So I want to turn to the recovery efforts in the I can't really say in the aftermath of COVID, in the aftermath of at least the first stages of the COVID pandemic. And the reason I want to talk about those is that they may actually have more of a long-term effect on emissions than anything directly arising from the pandemic. Europe was really in the forefront of this. The EU stimulus included almost $500 billion for climate and environment spending. And member countries also invested some of their own stimulus money in climate-related activities. As it notes here, about a third of Germany's stimulus plan went to public transportation, electric vehicles, and renewable energy projects. France invested almost $9 billion to shift to electric vehicles. There were smaller amounts in other countries. And the reason this is significant is that once you make these investments, for example, in new renewable energy projects, they're not temporary, even though the spending was, they're going to be there a long time. They can also shift private investment and innovation in the direction of the spending as the market sort of sees new opportunities. The US passed an infrastructure bill that I think was at least partly intended as stimulus, but that was also made possible by the fact that COVID spending had breached the $1 trillion barrier and therefore made much higher levels of spending politically feasible. The bill is not aimed directly at climate change, but it has a substantial amount of funding that is highly relevant to climate. 120 billion for low carbon transport, a lot of money for passenger and freight rail, both of which have much lower emissions than the alternative of cars and trucks. 39 billion for public transit, which again is much lower emissions per passenger mile. Low and zero emission buses, charging stations, energy storage. The hope of passing a major legislation in the form of the Build Back Better bill seems to have died, but there is still some talk of a spending bill containing the climate portions of that proposal. Who knows what will happen? It really depends on Joe Manchin and whether or not he can be brought to be on board for some kind of legislation. So I want to switch at this point and talk about the governance issues, which I think will connect in some ways, at least with the next panel. Again, what I think is really interesting is that despite the very different nature of these two crises, we do see some sort of related governance developments that I think are sort of revealing about where governance is globally right now and how things are evolving. In the COVID crisis, well, so looking at global institutions, and I'm not talking about all of them, for example, the WTO, which we've just heard about, but the WHO, which is the institution that is most directly related to COVID, has played an important role, but we learned that it's terribly underfunded for what it needs to do, and its funding is very insecure, which means that at critical points early in the pandemic, the WHO was hampered by its dependence on large donors like China. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the sort of scientific arm of the UN's climate effort, it has a lot more scientific independence, but funding is also a problem for other parts of the UN effort, in particular funds that are supposed to provide financing to developing countries. One of the things that's been really interesting, fascinating from my point of view anyway, with climate change, has been the surprising role of subnational governments in dealing with an international problem, which at least for me was quite unexpected. And what we saw in the US was that Trump basically is a climate denialist. He backtracked aggressively backtracked on previous climate policies. More recently, Biden has switched his perspective, but has limited options for a variety of reasons in national politics. But then the surprising thing is that local governments like California took the lead, with more states now setting carbon targets. California used to be way out in front, but states like New York, Washington, and others are now rapidly catching up. And we see a bit of the same story in Brazil, for example, with Bolsonaro, with climate denial at the national level, but still some efforts at the state and municipal level to make progress. COVID presented a somewhat similar picture, with Trump downplaying the crisis and dragging his feet on public health measures. And in the early stages, we saw states like Washington, California, and New York being much more aggressive. Also similar to the climate situation, Biden flipped the federal government's position. And the later stages, what we saw is divergence, right? Where in some states, we see strong populist resistance, both manifesting itself in public and in state governments in places like Florida and South Dakota. In Florida, you may know that the state government has recently advised against the COVID vaccine for children, contrary to federal and medical expert guidance. State resistance to climate change tends to be more passive. That is, some states are not doing anything, but we don't see as much of sort of actively trying to undermine climate action. And we don't see the same kind of, nobody's taking over state capitals as they did in the COVID in order to block climate action. And populist resistance has been a strong factor. Populists like Trump have taken a denialist stance. But I think there is this interesting difference in the strength and sort of nature of the backlash in the COVID situation. I don't have necessarily a great theory about that, but I think partly it reflects the inherently greater difficulty of regulating individuals versus corporations, which we see in other places in environmental law. It's really just much easier to regulate, especially large corporations. Regulating individuals involves a lot of monitoring and compliance problems, and I think has a higher likelihood of sparking sort of an emotional response. So, conclusion, temporary drop in the emissions, but that's pretty much gone away. The economic crisis, however, created the possibility of a green recovery. COVID response in terms of governance more or less fits the pattern with climate change, with the strong role for subnational governments, but a more severe backlash. And in both cases, we see what I'm sure is going to be a theme throughout the day, which is the need to strengthen international institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Farber. Our next panelist, Professor Kish Perella, encouraging sustainability in supply chains, mandating disclosures versus mandated due diligence. Kish?
Hi, thank you so much for giving me some time to share my research. I'm just going to stop time here. So one thing I want to talk about is really the supply chain as a significant instrument through which corporations make significant negative impacts, whether we're talking about human rights or we're talking about the environment around the world. And because of the potential for these negative impacts, regulators have experimented with different strategies for addressing what we would often think of as externalities. So the first wave, sort of supply chain regulation that we saw in human rights specifically, was information disclosure. And so the problem that regulators were addressing was that the market didn't work. That lots of people care about the human rights practices of corporations, but we find out about their practices when it's too late, when something terrible has happened. So, and the information that we obtain is also very limited. We don't get information on company policies. We don't get information on who's responsible for various functions. So we see the supply chain law that was introduced in California about 10 years ago, and in the United Kingdom around 2015, which is a mandatory information disclosure law. And the idea was that these laws would harness market mechanisms and trigger a race to the top, that consumers and investors and various civil society actors would now be able to compare these companies and provide market or other types of incentives for companies to simply do better. And these information laws really ask companies to share information with the public, often on their websites, about their due diligence practices. But for various reasons, that race to the top didn't happen. And NGOs have pointed out part of the reason for that is that there were sort of institutional failings in governance. So these laws that were introduced went so far, but not far enough. They said, tell us information, but neglected to include other types of institutional functions that are important for this sort of market sanction to work. For example, public lists of companies that have to report. That would be helpful, as well as what do they have to report? In the UK, there were issues about some companies reporting some information while others didn't. What metrics are used in order to measure what companies are doing, and how do we go about comparing these companies? So for these and other reasons, this race to the top didn't quite happen. And so we see a different strategy, which is mandatory due diligence. And this is different in the following way. Mandatory information disclosure requires that companies tell us what they do or don't do. It doesn't specifically require companies to do any particular thing, as long as they're upfront about that fact. In contrast, mandatory due diligence requires companies to take specific steps. And what's really interesting about this, and this is something that I explained in an article that I wrote for the Journal of International Economic Law, there's a leveling the field issue. A number of large companies actually favored mandatory due diligence. And that might seem surprising, but it's because the other strategy, market shaming, doesn't affect all companies equally. Some companies in particular sectors could be targeted, and other companies are consumer facing or they're large. So they're going to be subject to greater scrutiny and sometimes greater compliance costs, while their peer companies aren't. So mandatory due diligence offers a means to sort of level the field within sectors and across sectors regarding expectations for the environment and human rights. 2 weeks ago, the European Commission published its recent proposal on mandatory sustainability due diligence requirements. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into a deep dive into this, but it is notable for a couple of things. So it's a mandatory due diligence requirement that requires companies that meet certain thresholds to perform due diligence and adopt due diligence into their company policies. And that requires certain things like identifying potential and adverse impacts, also preventing, mitigating, and ending such actual impacts or potential impacts, monitoring due diligence, reporting on due diligence, and incorporating complaints mechanisms into their processes. What's notable for this conversation is that this due diligence applies to the value chain as well. And so it's not just the company's own operations, but also its subsidiaries and also its value chains. And I think it's important to highlight what the potential strengths and weaknesses are of this. Yes, this is encouraging regarding scope. And the proposal envisions contractual assurances as part of the mechanism by which these due diligence obligations were transmitted throughout the supply chain. And that's heartening as someone who studies contracts. But I also feel like it's important to recognize some of the limitations of contractual mechanisms for addressing certain types of sustainability concerns in the value chain. So for this proposal, NGOs have raised the issue, what do we do when we want to go beyond tier 1 suppliers? So for contractual assurances, a retailer can simply contract with a tier 1 supplier for certain substantive norms, maybe monitoring, auditing, various things. But what happens when we want to get beyond tier 1? Who is going to be responsible for binding tier 2, tier 3 suppliers to these substantive norms and processes, and who's going to enforce it? And what will be the quality of those processes? Independently of where we are in the supply chain, there are decades worth of criticisms over what has happened regarding contracts and supply chains, regarding human rights, labor, and various other concerns. We have identified concerns with monitoring, enforcement, auditing. But I have a different concern, specifically with contracts. While contracts are an important tool by which to transmit sort of governance strategies through the supply chain, my biggest concern is that contractual clauses, if done incorrectly, will get to sort of, I hate to call it, sort of the consequences of bad company policies. It's not getting to the root problem. And so we can see contractual clauses, but if they're not really tied to the core issues of how companies are engaging in harmful practices, then it's sort of at the margins and not really going to the core. And that's why I was heartened to see in the European Commission's proposal that we're talking about corporate duties. So the corporate duties that are introduced are not just about implementing and monitoring a due diligence process within the company, but also incorporating due diligence into strategy. And I think that's critical, and where I'm going to end my comments, because if we really want companies to meaningfully incorporate sustainability into their operations, including their value chains, it can't be just the policies that happen when their policies hit the ground, basically. When it's really thinking about how their policies impact other people, we have to go to more strategic decision making, really thinking about how the model of the business or how they're engaging in certain practices have these consequences. And so I think sort of prodding along the strategic lens is really, really helpful. It's important to keep in mind that it's not just regulators who care about sustainability in supply chains. Employees have staged walkouts, have leveraged various resources to incentivize companies to improve their practices. Consumers, I focus on investors and proxy advisors taking a very deep interest in the human rights practices of companies, specifically due diligence. And I'll just end with this one point for both regulators as well as various civil society actors. We can leverage all these sorts of stakeholder interests in sustainability and present it as either risk or strategy. So for risk, we can identify the various risks to the company that's posed by these various stakeholders taking an interest in sustainability, such as business risk, reputational risk, and so forth, potentially legal risk. But all these sorts of concerns are also about corporate strategy and corporate purpose. And I think that's where there's real potential for governance changes. That it's not enough to think about, these are the risks to the company if they don't pay attention to the risks to the external populations from their company operations, but to really think about what are the potential opportunities that corporations are not paying attention to when they're not thinking about these concerns that other parties are bringing to bear. And I think the more that governance strategies, whether it's the European Commission's proposal or potential treaty or other types of laws, incorporate strategy and opportunity into the regulatory design, the better that will be for supply chain governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Perella. That was really interesting, and I look forward to more discussion in the Q&A. Thank you. Our next speaker is Pedro Villarreal. He will be speaking to us about public international law in the age of COVID-19, from national to global health. Pedro, thank you for being with us today.
Yes, thanks so much to Elizabeth Trujillo and Sabrina Ragone for the invitation to join you today. It's a pleasure to follow up on such renowned panelists. And so when addressing this distinction between national and global health under international law and what role can international play in all of this, I will unfortunately leave more open questions than answers, but I will ultimately refer to the preceding presentations because in a way, most if not all of my arguments go back to how health is not just health quotation marks and strictly understood, but is rather a multidimensional issue by nature that depends on a series of determinants. So the fact that we can achieve more positive health outcomes in the middle of pandemics, for instance, depends on commercial determinants, as highlighted by Gabriel Marceau and Kishparella regarding vaccines and the supply chains that allow these vaccines to be manufactured. And they also depend, positive health outcomes also depend on environmental determinants, as Daniel Farber's presentation illustrated. I mean, with regards to climate change, it's not simply anecdotal, in my view, that the editors of hundreds of top medical journals issued a joint letter labeling global warming the biggest threat to public health known to mankind. So you see, achieving these the health outcomes that we wish to have in terms of improving physical and mental well-being is dependent on all of these determinants. And this is even more visible in what we know as all of society pandemics, meaning events that basically affect most, if not all, aspects of our lives. And so besides the commercial and environmental determinants that we have just heard about, I will now take the opportunity to briefly mention another dimension of health beyond these determinants basically the public health measures that have been adopted in the course of the pandemic, particularly the non-pharmaceutical ones. Perhaps the main reason why we're having today's event online and not in person, the measures of social distancing, as they're widely referred to, and colloquially known as lockdowns, right? So these measures, which are public health measures at the core, present a trade-off in many ways, and they're necessary because especially in the first stages of a pandemic and in the absence of the pharmaceutical remedies that will allow us to be protected against a novel disease. So these measures of social distancing carry a heavy toll, both socioeconomic and actually also a negative impact in the health of persons. Public health data has shown how these measures of social distancing, again, which may include stay-at-home orders, the closure of non-essential business and mandatory physical distancing between persons in public spaces, restrictions of public gatherings, and so on. And I believe we will hear more about this in the second panel of today, if I'm not mistaken. So these measures, needless to say, carry a heavy toll on not just socioeconomic, but also to the health of persons. Research has shown how, on a longer term, these measures can also have an impact on the health of persons, including their mental health. And additionally, it depends on the national legal system on who gets to decide whether to implement these public health measures or not. Right? It may be federal or central authorities or local ones, and this varies from country to country. So we already have a national, a division across national lines in terms of how these decisions to adopt these measures are made. And there may be a justification, right, for one way or the other. And ultimately, and going back to public international law, what the puzzle that we have seen where the decision to adopt these measures has fallen mostly across national lines depends on the fact that there is no global health police, so to say. There's no international organization that may exercise its authority in a unitary fashion in order to address not just, in order to make the decision, not just to adopt these public health measures or not, but also to how to tackle these other determinants of health, whether the environmental ones or the commercial ones. The World Health Organization, which, as Daniel Farber mentioned, is it has the core mandate in the field of international health. On the one hand, it does not have the capacity, as Daniel Farber highlighted, due to budgetary issues and the limits that its structure has. And on the other hand, and from a legal perspective, it was not designed to be such an organization. And when it was being founded and the aftermath of the Second World War, the idea was put forward that it could be the equivalent of a health police. It could exercise powers during health emergencies, even beyond the consent of its member states. It could have, but this was not to be. The founders of the WHO rejected this possibility. And this makes sense for multiple reasons, at least with regards to the health measures I've referred to, these lockdowns and so on. It makes sense for multiple reasons, right? It's unlikely that on the one hand, that these decisions can be transposed from the local or national to the global level, really. So we can imagine how difficult it would be to justify that the decision of whether we can leave our homes or not depends on personnel, either in Geneva, in where the WHO's headquarters is located, or from the other regional offices. We also have the Pan American Health Organization in Washington, DC. So it would be a bit strange that such sensitive decisions are made by these bodies beyond that are located at the international level. Additionally, because the political accountability that is necessary, to when these measures are adopted, cannot be so easily transposed from the local or national to the international. So the question that remains, right, with keeping in mind these limitations to really have a literally global response in terms of these measures, the question that remains is, well, what is left under for a global response to pandemics, particularly to future pandemics that may look differently than COVID-19. In COVID-19, we were quote unquote lucky enough that the speed with which vaccines were developed was astounding, but this may not be the case in future pandemics. So what will we do then? Well, we need to resort maybe to these other measures, public health measures that entail restricting individual liberties and freedom if and when authorities decide that this is necessary. So how do we navigate between this global health police, which is not realistic or desirable in multiple ways, and the anything goes approach that we saw during COVID-19 where each state or country decided fully on its own whether it would go ahead with these measures or not, and there seemed to be no limitation at the global level. So even though there is no one size fits all solution in terms of these public health measures, so it may be that they're justified for some countries but not for others. Nevertheless, how can we move from a national to a global health perspective for future pandemics? Hopefully we will not live another event like COVID-19 in our lifetimes, but it's of course best to be prepared for if and when that happens. And with that, I leave it to you again, Elizabeth. Thanks again for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Pedro. I was hoping to have an answer to your question, but it sounds like that's our job, that we must all try to find the solution to that very, very, very important question. Thank you, and thank everyone on the panel for this really intriguing and interesting discussion. And I thought I would just highlight a few common denominators in all the presentations, and then allow the panelists to perhaps make a few comments on each other's presentations if you'd like, or either ask questions. And then I know we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I'll pass that to Brian in a moment. So, one of the things that struck me about each of the presentations was this sort of in a way, a tension in the talks, right, which probably is a reflection of what's happening today and the transition that we're experiencing with respect to what is international law, what is the role of global institutions, which is, on the one hand, we have this global challenge, which is the pandemic, and we see sort of a weakness in governance at the global level to be able to manage it, at least to be able to manage it in a way that it can be operationalized and handled right locally. So we need a reliance on local institutions to be able to do that, but that has been very sort of patchwork and piecemealed. And so we have this sort of the role of trade, which I found very fascinating from Gabriel's presentation, sort of trade, which has been traditionally government to government, now taking on this role of facilitating discourse and dialogue, not just government to government, but now with the private sector. And so I have many questions around that, but I find that shift to be really an important one, especially for the role of the WTO, which has been one to discipline governments to facilitate trade. So that is on the one hand. On the other hand, we have sort of the impact that the global pandemic has had on carbon emissions, that in a way it's been a positive effect, right? And perhaps will continue to be because of this allowance for remote working and sort of the social distancing that Pedro talked about. But at the same time, I think employers and the private sector have realized there's some advantages to facilitating a little bit more remote work for various reasons. And so this may actually help us with this transition. But I also heard in his talk sort of the need for more global institutions, an enhanced role for governance on that side. So I'd love to hear more about what that might be moving forward, especially since I think they've taken on a different role currently, or they've understood their role differently in dealing with this pandemic. And then, of course, the thing that brings it together, which is the supply chains and the corporate side and the private sector, right? Which in the end is what facilitates the on-the-ground sort of management and access to vaccines and solutions in the context of the pandemic. And so, and sort of the sort of weakness in the traditional corporate social responsibility levers and the shift towards mandating due diligence requirements, mandated due diligence requirements around sustainability, and how that might be a welcomed sort of introduction into the supply chain and value chain context. And maybe that is the missing link that we've always had that we need to sort of enhance a little bit more to be able to make this connection between government and private. So those are some of the common themes. I'm sure there's some much more, but I guess the big question I have that I want to throw out there, and then I'll pass it on to the panelists to sort of chat and ask each other questions, which is that what is now the role of sort of global institutions? What have we learned about? Obviously, we've learned about sort of where their weaknesses lie, but they also have some strengths, right, in facilitating dialogue and dialogue among regimes, right? So health and private health and economics, health and local, global to local. And I wonder if maybe there's something to learn for the climate change side of things as we move forward in dealing with decarbonization strategies at the local level, whether if the WTO may take on that role or someone else. So those are that, and then of course, we also see, and we have not talked about this, the rule of law has not been discussed in this conversation. And so if there are any thoughts about that, and I think we all have a lot of thoughts about that, but in terms of enforcement of these things, is sort of where I'm going with that. It would be interesting to kind of, if you have any comments on that. So I will just, whoever would like to sort of start, I'll just open the floor. I do think one thing, Ed, if you could, I think there's a couple of panelists who cannot turn on their cameras. So Ed, if you could assist with that, please. And then we'll go to Gabrielle, who I believe has her hand up. There we go. So Gabrielle, would you like to start?
Briefly, but yes, I mean, I enjoyed very much the other presentations, and I congratulate you and Sabrina because the mix is really superb. And it is, as you concluded, an issue of governance for both problems, COVID and of course, climate change. But me, I'm more optimistic and positive. And I like the fact that you said there may be positive things. Indeed, I think that, and that's another area of research, is that IGOs, although limited, have had, at least the WTO, from my limited knowledge, an exceptional role. And in fact, because the solution requires local, regional, and global action and coordination at the three levels, it can only go through, or it best goes through via IGOs. They were created for that, but in times of crisis, they seem to be especially useful. Now, you mentioned different regime communicating to each other, what we call the trade-an. 30 years ago when I started, trade-an was a new discipline. Now, here in WTO, everything is trade-an because trade is everywhere, not only, as I mentioned, because you export cars, shoes, but if you need vaccine, you need the 32 items to compose them. My last point is the one I tried to make, but maybe I wasn't strong enough about this, and you highlighted it well. It's this classical mutually exclusive distinction of private and public international law and public international organization and public dispute settlement. Well, I don't know how we're going to go forward, because having begged the private sector to come closer, to speak to governments, and as I said, this is on a regular basis, how can we now in the future, in other area, ignore them? We cannot. So it will have a fundamental impact conceptually on those distinction private public, but more broadly. And I don't know the solution, but I think it's for the academics maybe to point, but governments have no choice, I believe, than collaborate with others. And then it means, as I said, new rules on competition, investment, all these issues need to be looked at from a different angle. Thank you.
May I just follow up with one question to Gabrielle, which is, what is your sense of sort of the rule of law aspect in terms of enforcing some of these standards that we're trying to put into play and work with private sector? I mean, is it going to shift the way we deal with national treatment, for example? I mean, you know, or some of the other trade rules where we're really disciplining governments, but now if we have standards that allow governments to do certain things that are even protectionist, and the corporate sector agrees to it because it complies with due diligence, for example, mandatory due diligence standards, will we have to see a shift in how we interpret these rules, or will we have a new sort of jurisprudence?
Well, I don't know. You know, the dispute settlement system here is under threat because it was too strong. But one way to deal with this issue, so either you give standing rights to companies as such, and they come here and they speak, and this I doubt that all developing countries, but what can be done is what is done, but minimally, under the TBT agreement, where governments have the obligation to ensure that their companies do ABCD, and where companies or other actors, institute, NGOs, have obligations to notify, like under the code, under the TBT or the SPS agreement. These two agreements have been dealing with non-governmental actors, and this is where we're going. I don't think that WTO will start suing companies in the US tomorrow. This is not the point, but there has to be a better connection between local, regional, and international to deal with climate change or COVID or anything. And your question, I think enforcement should remain at the respective level, but there has to be more transparency, more connection, and more responsibility from the states to ensure that certain things are done or not done by actors other than themselves. But it's complicated. It's a new era, I think.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Farber.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't talk about the private sector in my talk, and I thought it might be worth adding just a little bit. This obviously connects with what Kish was talking about. That's been another sort of surprising development. In fact, I just heard a paper about private governance by major investors like BlackRock, that have an outsized role in financial markets. And one of the things we've seen both at that level, but also at the level of individual firms, is firms really in many ways being out ahead of national governments and, you know, in some cases, state governments. So for example, when Trump announced that he was getting out of the Paris Agreement, a group called We're Still In was formed that had a large number of state governments, cities, but also corporations pledging that they would themselves meet the US Paris commitment in terms of the amount of emission cuts. And there are both, so there are all these individual actions, but there are also very active organizations, many of which are transnational, both of, for example, mayors in cities across the world, or but also many of these again also involve corporate participation. And one of the reasons I think activists are so interested in sort of pushing corporations is that countries may be retreating behind their borders, but corporations aren't. They're multinational, and if you can get major corporations to change their behavior and to push their supply chains in the same direction, you can have an international event without having to have an event with, without having to have 180 countries or whatever the exact number is these days unanimously agree to something as part of an international negotiation. I just saw this morning that the SEC is later this month going to issue a disclosure rule relating to climate change. So there's some synergism between the government and what's going on in the private sector.
Yes, definitely. Very, very interesting. And we definitely see on the economic side, I mean, even in the current Ukrainian crisis, sort of a more unified response on the economic side, then, and that seems to be an important aspect, right, of seeing the private sector engage in this way. We saw it with the pandemic as well, where certain, the companies took on sort of their own guidelines around COVID, which then pushed sort of local governments to do the same. So it's really fascinating. I don't know if anyone else would like to comment on each other's presentations, anyone else on the panel. Obviously there's a couple of questions as well in the chat. Kish, I don't want to put you on the line here, but we've definitely been referring to the sort of your presentation quite a bit in terms of supply chain management. I know Pedro had his hand up.
Oh, sure. So I could start with the question that was raised by one of the participants, and then I actually would love to follow up from some of the conversation that had just preceded this Q&A. So so there's a question posed by one of the audience members about codes of conduct. So the question is, do you believe that the best course is for companies to incorporate their codes, such as their supplier codes of conduct, into their supplier or service contracts? So I have a couple of reactions to this. That's a great place to begin, but here are some dangers. The first thing is that in order to sort of lower the cost of or encourage companies to do this, to adopt codes of conduct, put it into their contracts, there's going to be a push for standardization. So for example, the American Bar Association has put out some standard clauses that would be helpful for companies to sort of consider adopting and adapting into their own supply chain contracts. That's a great way to begin. However, here are some risks with that. One, codes of conduct often address the symptoms and not the root causes. So let's talk about some classic examples of labor abuses in supply chain. If we think about, long hours, unsafe conditions, various other things, you could put something in your code of conduct that says a supplier shall do X and Y or not do X and Y. But the real problem, the root cause has to do with the volume, turnaround times, pricing, and the short-term contracts that buyer companies employ in the supply chain. So what in your code of conduct is going to address that problem? If nothing in the code of conduct addresses that problem, then you as a company are not really doing anything. You may put something in the code of conduct, and that may appease various stakeholders like your investors or like consumer groups, and it may have some impact on the ground, but it's really susceptible to the concerns that NGOs have raised with the European Commission's proposal. which is that retailers or other large buyers are offloading the responsibility to their supply chain by saying, make sure you turn around this significant volume at this low cost, but while you're doing it, also don't commit these labor violations. And so it's a step in the right direction, but I think it really absolves companies of how the way they do business contributes to these issues. So if they're going to use these codes of conduct, it has to be specific to the company and the sector. It also has to be specific to this supplier and the particular human rights or environmental risk that is implicated in this company's relationship with this supplier. So that limits the copying and pasting activities even within one's own enterprise. You have to think about the unit and you have to think about the supplier. One quick thing about the previous conversation, apologies, I did engage in some shameless self-promotion by putting a link to a recent paper, but it definitely ties to what Dan was talking about in terms of subnational units forging their own path independent of national policy. Well, this paper that I put in the chat, it's called International Law in the Boardroom, it's on SSRN. It talks about corporations kind of doing that too. You see a sharp divergence between what American foreign policy was and what corporations were doing, but there are a couple of caveats that are important to think about. When we think about engaging the private sector, we want to think about incentives and time horizon. And so the way things are framed in terms of risk versus strategy can really determine who in the company is allocated responsibility for this, what metrics are used to evaluate effectiveness, as well as what kind of resources are committed to it. And the thing that I care the most about is institutionalization. We can all be heartened by sort of positive developments in the private sector, but how deep does that go and how long will it last? And that's really a question of institutionalization. So I think the way regulations are designed can impact internal institutionalized companies, but it's a question of making it clear what that pathway could be.
Really interesting. Thank you, Kish. I'm going to let Pedro chime in, and then I'll pass the baton over to Brian to ask a few questions and sort of more from the Q&A.
Yes, thanks. And actually, as a reaction to Gabriel Marceau's comment on how the tradition and the WTO are ready to speak of trade and there's also at the same time a tradition in health law to speak of health and indeed I forgot to mention in my presentation that there's an ongoing negotiation in Geneva, of course online due to the pandemic, but in Geneva to prepare or to draft a new pandemic treaty or other legal instrument in the field of pandemic response. And one of the main challenges is precisely to, since this is being undertaken in the aegis of the World Health Organization, how to deal with those, the commercial determinants of health, so how to deal with those aspects that had to do with international trade law. And these, of course, cannot go around the WTO. So the WHO doesn't, cannot simply overstep its mandate. And, all of a sudden we have a treaty that regulates trade outside of the WTO. This is one challenge that is currently being discussed in terms of how do we envisage a future international law, an international legal instrument that, for instance, foster more equity in the global distribution of vaccines without addressing the commercial aspects of it. It's not possible in my view. And on the other hand, at a more factual level, indeed, another challenge could be even if there is no, let's say, stronger commitment in the area of the global distribution of vaccines in terms of, states binding themselves on how they will distribute vaccines in the future. There are nevertheless efforts at scoping and monitoring what existing capacities we have in terms of manufacturing, the ability to manufacture these pharmaceutical remedies as soon as possible in case we face this again. And an NGO has undertaken this function, not the WHO, right? So we again have the non-state actors conducting these functions. An NGO, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, a Norwegian NGO, has recently made a scoping of the global supply chains that are needed for manufacturing of vaccines, because ultimately we can only be better prepared once we know what capacities are currently in place, and for instance, how many developing countries and for example, actually have the capacity to manufacture these pharmaceutical remedies by themselves, and when there is no such capacity, so how can we then ensure that these countries nevertheless have access to those medicinal goods that are needed to respond to pandemics. So this to me is a major challenge, and I fully agree with preceding comments by Gabriel, Daniel, and Kish that it cannot work without engaging with the private sector and other non-state actors. It simply cannot be done, in my view. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you, Pedro. So before I pass it on to Brian, he has a few questions. I wanted to also mention there's a few folks from the roundtable too that are also online. And if you all want to chime in, please feel free to do so. You can either raise your hand or write something in the Q&A or in the chat, or just let me know that you'd like to say something. We'd love to hear from your perspectives as well. Brian?
Good morning, everyone. The first question relates primarily to supply chain sustainability and some regulation that we've already been talking about. As of 2021, 60% of the world's roughly 60,000 ocean-bound vessels are using heavy fuel oils or bunker oil. It's a less refined and highly toxic fuel that is cheaper to purchase, but ultimately more damaging to ecosystems and more toxic to humans and animals. Given today's roundtable focus on local solutions to global issues, what can national governments do to better mitigate the public health, climate, and sustainability concerns arising from the use and transportation of these heavy fuel oils? And as a follow-up to that, what, if any, aspects of that intersection are better addressed by the private sector rather than governments?
It's a great question, big questions. So I'll open it to the floor, and I think there's a lot of pieces to that question, right? In terms of it's an example, a really good example of maybe an economic thing that affects the climate as well as energy, and then how do we govern this, and how do we deal with this type of global challenge? Anyone want to take a stab at it? I guess one question that comes to mind for me is, okay, this is a global problem. It's energy, really, but it has environmental impact. It can also have health impact. So it crosses various regimes, right, in terms of the global aspect. And ultimately, it's private, right, because they're the ones sort of transporting this. So there's a contract there, there's liability there. And then we have, perhaps, depending on when it happens, maybe local rules around how to manage cleanup and whether or not they were in compliance with rules around how to transport these things and so forth. That's how I'm thinking about the question. So I don't know if some of you all might want to chime in terms of your specific expertise on how to deal with an issue like that.
I may come in with a short comment, but I'm really not the best expert, but just to raise, again, maybe more questions. I was asked not long ago, why is it that the Paris Agreement could find a conclusion and it's difficult here? And is it because of the type of treaty? And this brings me to my question suggestion. Maybe the sort of obligations that were put traditionally on countries need to be looked at differently. You know how Paris functions. There's this sort of global assessment of what would be needed, and then you leave it to each country to decide how they will do it domestically. And the expert calculated that this would be sufficient, but a lot of flexibility as to how to do it. And nonetheless, an obligation of ultimate result. So I don't know, I'm throwing a question, maybe even the way we traditionally look at international obligations between states should change, or we could even think of like ICSID 50, 60 years ago with investor-state dispute settlement, where you start having real hybrid thing. So maybe you could have treaties that are government to government, and then sections or annexes or another part that is hybrid or mixed, doubled with what I mentioned, TBT, SPS type of approach, clear obligations imposed by the government in light of its own system to companies. But when you impose an obligation on an entity, and I'll stop here, you have to give them rights. You cannot impose obligations on multinationals to notify the WTO and do this and that, and then you don't give them rights. But when some developing countries say companies, US multinationals should not have rights in this building, well, then there's a clash. And this is what will have to change.
Yes.
I have no answer as to how, but.
No, but it raises all the sort of different issues that this hypo sort of brings up, right? And I think we think of energy as sort of in its own cabin, but it is so integral to all the different aspects that we've talked about, right? And we don't have really a very good sort of overriding treaty or rule around how to manage these things. But at the same time, it's something that you have to manage locally, right, too. So, and I agree with you, you cannot impose obligations without also imposing rights and providing rights. I don't have a very good answer either, but I do think it raises a ton of really interesting intersections and questions. Brian, I don't know if you wanted to follow up. I know Professor Farber wanted to chime in as well.
Brian, go ahead if you wanted to follow up.
I was just going to zoom out the question slightly in scope. I think at the core of this is a question of whether globalized solutions are better suited to combat the race to the bottom mentality in terms of cost and supply chain. And given that there is a race to the bottom in terms of pricing out things such as energy costs to transport, how does that interplay affect the interests of human rights, public health, public safety? And are localized solutions or globalized solutions, in your opinion, more efficient and better situated to address that type of an issue?
Dan?
Okay, that's a much broader question than I feel qualified to answer. And I'm sort of handicapped by a lack of knowledge of international maritime law in terms of answering the question about shipping. I know that there have been a number of disputes about things like requirements for hulls for oil tankers and the extent to which that gets negotiated internationally versus some, at least, pressures on governments to institute their own regulations for their own waters. But I have to admit, I just don't really know the treaty background in that setting well enough to speak to it. There's an interesting kind of analogous problem with aviation. The EU said that it was going to require flights terminating or beginning in, I think, or beginning in the EU to purchase carbon allowances based on the emissions for the entire flight, not just the parts in EU waters or EU territory. And that was quite controversial. And there were, I know, complaints about that as to whether it would violate, I don't know, WTO requirements or other international law things. But it was effective in pushing the International Aviation, whatever it's called, conference, to itself come forward with some requirements for reducing emissions from aircraft used for these international flights. So I think we might see a kind of interplay in which actions by nations or regional entities like the EU may be acting as a prod for greater international action. I think that also happened with the issue of tanker safety, but I don't know that story as well.
Yeah, that's really fascinating how sometimes actions in one sort of area can push dialogue in another place. So you don't always need to have a very structured sort of governance model or treaty necessarily. You can have something that's much more informal and still get to some solutions. Kish?
Thanks. I mean, that's exactly where I was going to add to that. We think about the supply chain as the target for regulation, but there has been a lot of research over the decades about how supply chains disseminate norms from one jurisdiction to the other. And maybe part of the regulatory strategy is just incentivizing the corporation, not just to serve as a target regulation, but as sort of the distribution pathways of these norms. And so supply chains are one way. So if you think Brian, going back to your question about local versus global, there's no hard division between the two. So if you have a jurisdiction like France or the UK or Australia, and it's regulating the supply chain, well, the responsive policy by, I don't know, Apple or whatever, is going to at some point disseminate through its own supply chain, which is going to have significance for how that company operates globally, but also how its peers operate. So there's a way, and it's hard to map and try to get handle on it. One thing I've been trying to focus on is enterprise risk management. So to what extent can jurisdictional regulations predicate basically some kind of company policy that a company is going to treat at the enterprise level? And if it's going to treat at the enterprise level, then here we go, right? It's going to go across units within the companies, across countries, and that's going to have real implications. And so it's an interesting conversation, but it's hard to, I think for me anyway, to try to put it out in an intentional way of how X will lead to Y.
Really interesting. Thank you. So we have 3 minutes left before we're going to go to the break. I don't know if Brian, you wanted to ask one more question, or would you? I know you had maybe one other question that you wanted to ask, but we're a little bit short on time, so just let me know if we can make it short.
Of course. Similarly situated in the realm of public health, what can we learn from the global pandemic about the role of international institutions like the WTO in terms of balancing private intellectual property rights against public interest in rapid development and advancements in medicine? Is the global interest in procuring a vaccine more important than the private interests in terms of local governance of intellectual property rights?
So this is a question that really gets to the heart of the TRIPS waiver, I think.
I can say a word, but I think our colleague from the Max Planck, he's gone. Oh. I think that the question is very good, excellent, because it points to the world questions that they are debating in this small sort of negotiation group of ministers. And it goes into sort of fundamental, I understand informally, philosophical debate, because for instance, the Europeans, the Swiss, the UK, who oppose the waiver would simply say, and I'm not reporting anything confidential, this is sort of known, well, if we give it to you for the vaccine that now, tomorrow it's going to be with cars, and the day after with computers, and they would argue it's the foundation of our society, democracy, and it's directly linked to innovation, and this is therefore IP. Where others would take a different line and would say, well, the pandemic is the priority, forget the rest of everything. But another question that is exchanged all the time is, if I give you the waiver tomorrow and you can copy, what will it change to your production of vaccine? Is it going to produce more vaccines? And you often hear informally, because there's much less sort of corridor talks because of COVID, although here we have reopened, it's the debate is, funny enough, very conceptual and almost philosophical, because it's so important, intellectual property. And I don't want to talk about US, China and all that, but this issue, intellectual property, is much more than my patent. It's about innovation.
Yeah.
But at the same time, then comes the pandemic. So I'll stop here, and I'm sure Pedro, others will have comments.
Well, thank you. I will only subscribe to Gabriel said. There is a dilemma, of course, in how to increase manufacturing capacity. And the question is indeed whether a TRIPS waiver would allow for this. But it's a major debate and it's beyond the WHO. That's what I would add for sure. Thank you. I think the time is already.
Yes. No, I wanted to thank you and to thank Brian for your very intriguing and helpful questions. Is really pushing us to think, to push the envelopes and think deeply into how do we bring these various areas together and find solutions. And clearly it's both in the public sector and the private sector. So thank you all for your contributions, for the interesting discussion. We will go to a 15-minute break. We are back. Thank you. We are back for our second roundtable for today's webinar on global challenges and local solutions, supply chain sustainability and governance. And the second roundtable is entitled Governance, Comparative Constitutionalism and Social Justice. So I want to pass the baton over to the chair of this panel, my collaborator, Professor Sabrina Ragone from the University of Bologna. Thank you, Sabrina.
Thanks a lot. I will just start thanking my colleague and friend, Professor Trujillo. It's been a pleasure and a privilege for me to co-host last year's webinar series and today's follow-up webinar. We both hope we will be able to pursue this collaboration between our institutions further in the next years. I am also extremely grateful to our speakers and everybody who is attending the webinar today. And I also hope to be able to welcome you in my home institution. The building is from the 18th century, so not as modern as the one which we may be able to meet soon in Houston, but I can tell you it's truly worth being there. So this second panel is entitled, as Elizabeth mentioned, Governance, Comparative Constitutionalism and Social Justice. And some of the issues we are going into today were addressed from a different perspective over last year's webinar series. For example, we had the privilege of having the three speakers of today's panel throughout the webinar series. We addressed with them the role of domestic governments within the management of the COVID-19 pandemic emergency. We talked about the conflicts between national and international levels with respect to inequalities, and also we talked about the response in the US, Mexico, and other Latin American countries. Let me briefly introduce our speakers and the topics that they will address today. For anything that was addressed last year, please watch the videos that have been uploaded on the website of the Institute, of the initiative. So Tom Ginsburg, none of our speakers need any presentation, so we'll be very brief. Tom Ginsburg teaches international law at the University of Chicago, and he's known to address hot topics. 4 years ago, he co-authored the book, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, analyzing the global wave of populist leaders and its impact on democracies. I don't need to add how hot the topic is still today. And last year, he published with CUP, Democracies and International Law, which is also the title of today's talk. And he addressed the different approaches that authoritarian regimes and democracies have vis-a-vis international law. But of course, I'm not saying anything else because he will tell us a lot of this today. The second speaker of this panel is Professor René Urueña. He teaches international law at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, and he also collaborates with the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg at the moment. He always provides a very wide theoretical analysis of legal issues intersecting legal theory and international law. And today he will be focusing mainly on inequalities and to what extent international law can actually do something about that. His talk will be framed within the debate on transformative constitutionalism in Latin America. And third, last but not least, Alberto Abad Suarez Avila, who is a professor and coordinator of the Sociology of Law department at the Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas in Mexico City. His talk will focus on the social impact of the pandemic in the Americas with respect to one specific topic, which is not so specific actually, which is institutional deficits. And unfortunately, there are several in different areas, for example, healthcare systems, education, labor, etc. So I am very happy to welcome our speakers today and also the attendees, and I will leave the floor to Tom, who is the first speaker. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much to Professors Ragone and Leo for organizing this. It's a really great event, always very topical, and also privileged to share the floor, as it were, with my friends Alberto and Renee, and so I'm hoping we're going to have a great discussion. I want to talk about the book that Sabrina mentioned. It's called Democracies and International Law, and it was published in December, just at the end of the year. And my dream for the book, of course, that it would be completely irrelevant by now, but unfortunately seems to be much more relevant with the invasion of the Ukraine. So what I'd like to do is very briefly give you the overview of the argument and then, talk perhaps a little bit about its relevance for supply chains and such. So let's see if I can successfully share the screen. Always a trouble, always a challenge at this moment. Let's see.
We can see it now.
Yep, sorry for the brief delay. So basically, the book is making three arguments. First of all, and I want to make a background point, which is that international law in general doesn't require democratic governance. I don't believe that it does. There was a big debate about this, but I don't think that makes sense in a complicated interdependent world where we have many different kinds of governments. International law is a more thin, regime to govern regimes which have different approaches to how to govern themselves. But it is interesting, since this panel is very focused, program is very focused on Latin America. That is the one region of the world where there really is a right to democratic governance and a regional architecture that regularly enforces it. And I'm very, I think that's very impressive and important. But it's not really found with as much success, even in Europe, I would add, which one would think is sort of obviously has a much more robust institutional architecture, but has done much less to effectively constrain the problem of democratic backsliding in its midst. Maybe that will change going forward. My book focuses on the behavior of democracies in international law. Do they behave differently? There's lots of reasons to think that they would, lots of theory that says, democracies value transparency more. They will seek to provide public goods for their citizens, some of which, of course, can only be produced at a transnational level. Democracies also, I think, tend to have different time horizons, right? Vladimir Putin is thinking only about, his political survival and his legacy in history. But he doesn't really have the same long distance time horizon that a ironically short-lived American president would have. An American president knows that they will be out of office and may sometimes try to extend their policies, beyond their own political life, because they know that their regime is going to continue. And so that difference in time horizons means that democratic leaders tend to want to lock in policies at the international level to a greater extent. So there's a theoretical, argument here. And I look empirically. So I look at international behavior and ask whether things like we were hearing about in the last panel, the WTO, maritime law. There was a great question about maritime law. The International Postal Union, public goods that don't really have a specifically democratic character. What's the role of democracies and non-democracies in their production? And it's stunning what I found, I think. More democratic countries are much more inclined to conclude publicly available treaties. So this is using the Varieties of Democracy Index, dividing all countries into 5 different groups. And you can see the average number of treaties that countries have, and more democratic countries have more treaties. I actually look to try to isolate the effect. I look at what I call togglers, a certain kind of countries, which, if you think about it, you could probably imagine some examples. They're not like solidly democracies or solidly dictatorships, but they go back and forth. Turkey's an example, Nigeria, some periods it's democratic, some periods it's not. So what I did to try to get at the effect of democracy on treaty signing was to look at those countries and ask whether they were more likely to sign treaties during the years they were democratic. And I control here for their wealth and their number of neighbors, which would be important. And basically this figure, I won't try to explain the numbers, but what it shows for those who can read it is that such countries are more than twice as likely to sign a treaty in the years in which they're democratic. And I go on and look at all kinds of things. This is investor-state dispute settlement, which is certainly relevant to supply chain type of issues. And those cases, it's much more likely to be brought by a citizen or a corporation based in a democracy against another democracy than any other kind of, dyad, if you Finally, I look at like the environment, the institutions in which global rules are set. Again, this great question last panel about, international maritime environmental pollution, right? That's the International Maritime Organization / the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The International Maritime Organization, a good example of like a technocratic international organization that makes important rules that none of us ever know about. And so I happen to look at UNCITRAL. And during a period when only 40% of countries were democracies, the working groups on these 3 topics, transport, insolvency, secure transactions, were dominated by democracies. They talk more, they attend more, and they just have an outsized influence on international law in general. So that's sort of the first point I make in the paper. I'll pause for a second. Now, I also look extensively at democracies that join together to defend democracy. I'm not going to talk about that so much right now because it's a very big topic in and of itself. But I do want to talk about another development, which is what I'm calling authoritarian international law. And we really saw this very recently, obviously, with Putin's justification for the invasion of the Ukraine. So one of the findings from our studies of national constitutions, back to where I wanted, was that, in general, in constitutions and governance institutions generally, new ideas come from democracies. It's a point that Professor Marceau made last panel. Democracies innovate, they come up with new ideas. But then what we see in governance is that authoritarian regimes copy those ideas, sometimes try to dilute them, and certainly repurpose them for their own, purposes of political survival. So, for example, Vladimir Putin has raised the genocide issue as being the justification for his invasion of Ukraine, and also is sometimes talking about self-determination of people in the Donbass. Now, obviously, by any definition, this is a war of aggression. I don't think there's much dispute about that. And it's an old style, 19th century, pre-World War II style war of aggression, to take new territory. But you see that the justification is in democratic terms, and that's interesting. We also see throughout the international legal system dilution of concepts like human rights and democracy by dictatorships. I note here, I have a quote from Jiang Zemin, the president of China, saying, we have to go out and use international law as a weapon to defend our state and maintain national pride. And I would submit that the Chinese government has done a great job of that since Jiang Zemin's time, and now has a very elaborate international, legal presence in every institution. Far more heads of United Nations institutions are Chinese than, say, American. And in all of these institutions, these extremely adept, very good Chinese international lawyers are, of course, at the end of the subject to the discipline of their domestic system of government, which means that at some level they are agents of that system. I call authoritarian international law legal behavior designed to extend the survival and reach of authoritarian rule across space and time. And I have a bunch of different examples about how international law is actually changing. In kind of, again, areas you wouldn't think, things like the law of the sea, things like certainly external security arrangements and such, and a lot of cooperation by authoritarians to repress each other's dissidents and things like this. So I think that's an important development. Now, it does affect the supply chain issue. This is just an image of the Belt and Road Initiative. I want to, you might think that my discourse, and I really do worry about this, there's a lot of discussion of like a new Cold War between democracies and dictatorships, and I reject that, actually. I don't think the US and China are going to be in a new Cold War, notwithstanding the rhetoric that we're seeing from both capitals. Even Russia, in my view, with this invasion, is not opposed to democracy per se. It simply has these security interests that it puts over every other interest. And I think I can provide some evidence for that. The One Belt, One Road initiative, which of course any discussion of supply chains has to understand, is an effort to integrate these economies, with a lot of Chinese capital and a good deal of development assistance, a lot of infrastructure, new trade routes. And I don't think that, there's no interest. China is perfectly willing to tolerate democratic countries in this group, but it also has economic interests in all the countries of the group and will, ensure or act to maximize the probability of those economic interests sort of paying off. And so this is, you can't talk about a map like this without talking about supply chains, without talking about the law of the sea and what the rules are going to be about transportation, about investment law, about lots of different things, which I think we are going to see much more influence of authoritarian governments in terms of shaping. Again, they're not trying to destabilize democratic governance per se. They are trying to ensure that their investments are secure and stable. And sometimes that's going to lead to a tendency to cooperate with corrupt leaders, with dictators, with whoever can dictate the goods, whoever can deliver the goods in the program. And so the supply chains, which you would think is just purely in the realm of economics, are in fact affected very deeply by economic interest in global economic cooperation that actually is affected to some degree by even an unintentionally authoritarian character because of the big players in the system. Okay, I was told to keep it very brief, so I'm going to stop now, but obviously I have much more to say. I'm happy to talk more.
Thanks a lot. I'm sure that there will be questions for you in the Q&A session. And I would like to give the floor to René, not before having reminded all our attendees that there is the Q&A section where you can write your questions, and we will be happy to address them at the end of the panel. René?
Thanks, Sabrina. Can I share my screen, please?
Of course. Yeah, we
Wonderful,
can see.
thanks. Wonderful, thanks. Okay, yeah, so very briefly, I'll try to keep it also very brief. So my argument, or the kind of research that I'm doing now, is on inequality and transformative constitutionalism in Latin America. And then my basic argument here is that despite transformative constitutionalism being, as Tom was mentioning before, kind of the poster experience of using public law to achieve democracy or to transform societies in a very deep way, in fact, it has left the notion of equality on the side. And what I'm trying to say is that transformative constitutionalism needs to take inequality more seriously as a normative commitment, as a doctrinal construct, and as a cognitive framework. So that's more or less the idea that I have. And basically what I'm going to do in the next 7 minutes or so is to explain you why. So basically, the idea or the challenge around transformative constitutionalism is that it builds on the normative premise that the distribution of resources is not important, but rather how, but rather the fact that some individuals in society are excluded. So the problem is not that resources should be equally divided, but rather that some people don't have enough. And so in essence, the way we think about that in most Latin American constitutions and by the Inter-American system of human rights is that, like things like this don't matter. So for instance, Jeff Bezos is really worth 1,000 times more than his labor lawyer, but that really doesn't bother us. So that's more or less normal. There's really no problem with that, because the problem is people who really don't have access to certain services and certain basic goods. And then the problem then is that while we talk, and most constitutions in Latin America and the Inter-American system of human rights does speak of, they do speak of inequality, it's actually a proxy. And in fact, what they refer to when they talk about inequality is really radical social exclusion. And then obviously the answer to that is socioeconomic rights. And then socioeconomic rights are being applied widely in Latin America, and that's really one of the key aspects of developments in transformative constitutionalism. So how very complex legal issues are being translated as, very complex political and economic issues are being translated as legal issues that are then subject to adjudication through the justiciability of socioeconomic rights. Understanding these socioeconomic rights as bringing, or rather providing, those in society who have very, very little with the very basics, but without considering those who have a lot, and particularly without considering distribution of resources, which is really what we would understand colloquially and normally as inequality. So basically the point there is really that up to now, despite all its successes, transformative constitutionalism basically fails to consider income inequality. And why is that? So there are really four biases. Why is that? So the first one is that for better or for worse, neoclassical economic thinking is still dominant in the way we think about economics in Latin America. Even after the Washington Consensus, still we think that distribution is politics, and then efficiency, or rather to the way in which we grow the pie and know how we distribute it, is a technical issue. And then because the law, and this is a typical Latin American formalist approach, because the law is not political, then it shouldn't concern itself with distribution. It should just consider itself with giving people the bare minimum. The second is obviously this pro-courts bias in Latin America, and therefore it makes it easier to talk about socioeconomic rights in terms of giving the bare minimum and not talk about distribution. The third is, and we're going to come back to this idea later on, is the underlying anti-revolutionary bias all around Latin America, obviously built on suspicion of distribution as revolutionary politics because of guerrilla movements, because of the idea of the enemy within, which is obviously now just growing with what's happening in Ukraine and in Russia. And then finally is the ideas that transformative constitutionalism and in general human rights law, or the ideology surrounding human rights law, has very strongly tried to separate or create distance with prior thinking in Latin America, particularly 1970s, and particularly dependentist theories. These theories are saying, like old-fashioned, they're saying like they don't belong to today's world of human rights and technocracies. And then, and this is important because then these ideas of distributions were dropped obviously in the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. And then because the SDGs are brought wholesale into Latin American governance, then the notion of equality of inequality, so thus understood, are not brought into the equation when we apply human rights to achieve, obviously, the Sustainable Development Goals. What's the challenge with this? And what's the reason why I'm very briefly saying we should, in Latin America, turn over to this? So the problem is, and again, so we have Russia to look at. The problem is the capture of the democratic process and the rise of oligarchy. So it's clear, it's obvious, but then because Latin America is so unequal, then the big challenge is that this inequality, or rather, that the main transformative language in terms of human rights and democracy in Latin America, the fact that it is that language is not talking about inequality, then in a way it obfuscates the fact that this inequality is instrumental to capturing the democratic process. And therefore, it might be instrumental for the rise of a very, very small elite that controls politics in that sense. How? Obviously, you know, like through funding of the political process and all that, but the impact is wider. And it is first that ancillary institutions, meaning, you know, these regulatory institutions, the central bank, all these institutions then are easily captured. And then the next dimension is really this idea, this lack of empathy, the fact that, you know, parts of society are just unable to identify with others, and this huge division within society, and the fact that society is unable to create this basic constitutional consensus, which is in fact the main success of transformative constitutionalism. So the main success of transformative constitutionalism is a very basic constitutional consensus, in the sense that constitutions and courts should be, and in general public law, should be instrumental to at least create this very basic level of democracy. And then the fact that this very radical inequality is not being tackled by transformative constitutionalism means that it is not tackling this huge polarization that in turn undermines this basic constitutional consensus. And that's something that we're seeing obviously elsewhere in the world, and we're starting to see in Latin America. And kind of the barrier of defense that we have against this kind of radical polarization, which is the basic consensus of Latin American constitutionalism, then it's basically turning a blind eye into this inequality problem. And then, so I'm going to go very fast through this. And then, so if that is the challenge, and that's the problem that we're seeing, what is it? So how do we start thinking about these kind of things? And then I have 2 or 3 ideas about that. So I guess that the first challenge is that we should start thinking within transformative constitutionalism of equality as a normative principle in and of itself, so that it has analytical and comparative power. So there is really no common economic model in the region in terms of constitutions, and the idea of equality therefore becomes very difficult to tackle. But we need to work more on what would it mean to talk about inequality in these terms. We have been, in a way, importing from both Europe and the US kind of very procedural notions of equality. And that has had an impact in the way in which adjudication is happening in Latin America. I think we need to kind of change that tide, and then look at equality more substantively as distribution of income. And then and in that sense, we need to think also of the redistributive impact of socioeconomic rights. So not only how is it that socioeconomic rights give the bare minimum to some, but also how can socioeconomic rights, also speak of redistribution and speak of income inequality. Third, obviously, the role of international financial institutions and rule of law reform in these contexts. And then fiscal policy. So we have this huge division between fiscal policy and monetary policy on the one hand, and transformative constitutionalism on the other. And that connection has not been made. So the idea is that we think further about how to think inequality in those terms. Well, because the challenge is huge. The challenge is huge in the sense that once this very basic minimum consensus that we are seeing, that we saw in the 1990s and so on, in Latin America emerged, starts to kind of fall apart, then it's very hard to put it together, back together first. And second, it may have a very direct impact in the kind of foreign policy that different states could undertake. So that's the reason why I think I decided to talk about this right now. I think that there's an important connection there, and that important connection should be explored from the perspective of transformative constitutionalism. I'll leave it there so that we can discuss more. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, René. We are now going to the assessment of institutional deficits. I would like to leave the floor to Alberto. We can see your slides.
Great. Thank you very much, Sabrina. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm always very happy to come to the University of Houston. Also like to remember our good friend, Steve Zamora, which was the one that made me be in touch with you. And very happy to share this table with René and Tom. I'm going to talk about social justice and institutional deficit in the Americas. And the first thing I want to say is that when I'm talking about the Americas, I'm talking about the whole continent, from Alaska to Patagonia. Because I have this approach here, and you are going to understand very fast why. And it's because I think this pandemic hits the continent as a whole. So I would like to also try to provide some responses with that perspective. So I'm going to start with some of the current data. Worldwide, we have over 446 million cases. And in the Americas only, we have 148 million cases, which make us the second worst region in the world. And we have three countries in the top 12 with more confirmed cases. Of course, the recollection of this data has been very, it's not reliable, but at least we know that three of our countries have most of the confirmed cases. When it comes to that, the scenario is worse because we have passed the 6 million people dead in the last few days. I remember last year when I had this talk with you, we were just reaching 3 million, so we just duplicated it in 1 year, and this is a tragedy. This is like the very worst scenario that anyone could imagine. And in the continent, we have over 2.5 million people deceased, and we have 5 of the top 10 countries with more death. And well, this is still going on. Cases are, we're still counting cases, we're still counting deaths. And we have some other data about like how this pandemic has been very, very bad for the continent. Last year, the GDP growth was one of the worst regions in the world. And sorry, in 2020, we had one of the worst growth in the world. And in 2021, we had a rebound, we have a recovery. That was better in some countries. Other countries, for example, like Mexico and Argentina, that already before the pandemic had been struggled with the economy, couldn't recover that fast. But the economic damage of the pandemic was very, very strong in the continent. So I wonder, and this is also we have like these vaccination rates that make us think that if we don't find like a new variant that gets very, very much worse, I think we can reach an exit soon if our calculation of vaccination rates is good enough. And I wonder, and after looking at this data, I wonder why the pandemic hit too hard on the Americas, and also who is to blame for the catastrophe. And if we look at the press, and it's funny because for the last 2 years, pretty much I spend my time here in these 4 walls, inside these 4 walls, and my contact with the world has been through press, to media. And if you look at that, it seems like the one to blame is either the anti-vaccine movement or populist governments, or the development model, or inequality and poverty. And I think like there is, in each of these answers, there is some truth. But I would like to focus on weak institutions, and I will explain why. Of course, when we look at institutions, we have to think that institutions are like a common significance of institutions is that they are good to reduce uncertainty in complex contexts. So when we look at a problem like this one, I think it's good to know what kind of institutions we had to try to provide answers to this very complex context. And I would like to go through healthcare, our healthcare systems, and what I call for the region, not only for Latin America, but for the region, and every man for himself model, or the idea that the region didn't have something very strong for a society, but more for each one. And I would like to say that the region moved towards a private healthcare system in the 90s. This movement provoked that we put very little attention to public policies oriented to combat the big public health problems like obesity, diabetes, drug abuse, cancer, etc. Even the public expenditure in healthcare has been rising constantly in the region. That is about $1,000 per capita per year. It is still far from OECD average, that it's $4,000. If we look at numbers, the US spends too much on health and Latin America too little. And we're going to see some of these numbers. And as a result, I think in the continent, we have a focus on personal healthcare versus public healthcare approach. And when the pandemic hits, this became a big problem. And like it could help to have these big numbers in the damage of the pandemic. And well, the continent has the highest personal expenditure to cover COVID-19, and we will see why. If we look at the current health expenditure, we see that some of the countries in the continent, like the USA, expend much more than the recommended. The recommended is 10%. The USA expends over 16%. And we have countries like Cuba and Canada that are around that, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay. But then we have like countries like Mexico, Then we have countries like Mexico, Venezuela, Peru that spend half of the recommended. So our health expenditure is less than what is recommended. Then we have a high domestic private health expenditure. The USA spends over $5,000 per year per capita, and OECD members, that's 3 times the OECD members average. Then we have probably only one country, Canada, that is around the recommended expenditure. And then we have the rest of the American countries spending very little. When looking at as an average, it's a lot, but very little when it comes to counted in dollars. We see here that some countries like Guatemala, Brazil, Honduras, they spend around 60% of their expenditure. It's domestic, private, and private. And we see that most of the countries in the region, Mexico spend over 50%, the United States around 50%, Chile around 50%. Many of the countries have a big domestic expenditure. When COVID hit, many of our countries depended on an out-of-pocket expenditure, and this being critical because countries like Guatemala, they have over 50% of their expenditure in an out-of-pocket model, and then you have Mexico with 42, Chile with 32. And you see that all these expenditures are over the top of, are in the top of the national expenditure in the world, and they are over the averages. For example, the OECD, they have an average of 13.8%. North America, the United States, they don't spend a lot out of the pocket, but still their private expenditure is very, very high. Okay, and this last table shows that and related to what Rene was saying, is that the continent is very unequal, and we see that only Canada and El Salvador are under 40 points in the Gini index, and then the rest of the countries in the continent are over it, like including the United States and Peru, Bolivia, and you see that it goes from 33 in Canada to 53 in Brazil. And these numbers are very, very high. Like the inequality in the continent is very high. So when you have a health system that relies on domestic private expenditure, and you have these levels of inequality, then it's easy to understand why like a lot of the population has left out the attention in this, and they relied on what governments could do in an emergency context. Like we didn't have the institutions to face the pandemic, so what we did was build institutions in the middle of the storm, and the result is easy to understand if we know that we didn't have any good provision for this. I want to move from health. We can look at very different institutions in very different sectors. We could look at labor, we could look at security, we could look at many other different set of institutions. But I will go to democracy and courts very fast to relate this with a legal approach. Talking about democracy, the region after a neo-constitutionalist period in the late 21st century, in the late 20th century, the region is back to hyper-presidentialism. There is very little space for deliberation and innovation because our democracies have come to a liberal versus populist trap, technocrats versus the people, whatever you want to call it. Corruption is followed by impunity. We have a weak rule of law, weak representation, weak participation in public life. And as a result of this, emergency powers during the pandemic were exercised by executives, formally and informally. And Congresses had very little control over legislation during this time. When we go to courts, the courts in the region have increased protection of human rights in the 90s, but their focus is mainly on individual rights. And at the education of economic rights only in recent years, many of the topics that Rene was talking about are including transformative constitutionalism have to be with economic rights, but still this is an incipient phenomena. It's not something widespread. Many of our courts still think in a civil rights paradigm. They don't work with economic rights in a good fashion. There are big gaps in access to justice. We still have an individual legal standing paradigm, which makes litigating economic right cases very expensive because you have to go decision by decision. And that is, as for example, tutela in Colombia proves that litigating on economic rights, especially on health, is very, very expensive. Then we still have a weak public expenditure on the judicial branch. Mexico is one of the worst with 0.4%. And then we have Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. The recommended is 1%, and only Brazil complies with this. We have weak regional institutions for the protection of human rights, especially economic and social rights, because we still have this jurisprudential dialogue paradigm, which means that it's not mandatory for courts to hear cases, but they can choose it, and it is, and they choose very, very few cases every year. Our legal education and legal profession are still very weak. And talking about the pandemic, during the pandemic, most judiciaries struggle with the provision of digital services. They have to move from in-person services to online. And that was very, very difficult for them. And the digital transition, of course, increased gaps in access to justice. And looking at what courts did during the pandemic, we see that they had a better protection of civil rights before restrictive measures than protecting the access to health. And we have some examples. For example, in Brazil, they call for action, or in Mexico, they guarantee vaccination. But still, I have the impression that courts did better protecting civil rights than expanding access to health. Okay, we have then these weak public institutions. I think a long-term pandemic scenario was not foreseen by constitutions, nor by international law. We were not ready. We don't have a legal framework to face this. Pedro Villarreal was talking about this, and I agree with him. We didn't control the spread of coronavirus and didn't control the damage with our institutions. Our health institutions were weaker to face the pandemic than other regions, and it's important to understand why. It's important to understand why our health system was not good enough for this. The whole continent struggled with providing medical attention to large sectors of the population, fiscal stimulus, job security, and the relevant decisions were concentrated mainly in the executive, congresses, and courts proved to be irrelevant. And pandemic shows that we have not built important social institutions in many years. And an important note here is that not in the liberal countries, neither in populist ones. Well, just want to finish this with 3 wishes. I don't think they're like proposals or anything. They are just wishes. I think we need to strengthen our democratic institutions. We need to rebuild robust social institutions, and we need to increase continental cooperation. This shows that the Americas have much more in common than what we've thought for the last century, 2 centuries, probably. And there are many issues that if we start cooperating more and if we look at what kind of institutions we build in the region and try to rebuild them, I think we can face the next catastrophe better. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alberto, for this presentation, and also for ending with the wishes. I would like to give the floor to the three speakers in order to let them comment on each other's talk, if they have any immediate comment, and then I will give the floor to Brian for the questions. And we also have a revolutionary question in the chat, the Q&A. Okay, Rene, I see you would like to start. Okay, and then Tom. We just changed the order. Rene, please.
No, Tom can go first, no problem.
We start with Tom?
Yeah, no problem. I just raised my hand.
Okay, Tom.
We couldn't hear you at all, Renee, so you might check your microphone. So, but
So while Tom is speaking, check the microphone.
yeah, but no, just a very brief comment, actually, on Alberto. I mean, I want to make a brief comment because I want to hear what everyone else has to say. But I was wondering if there's actually data on sort of a Gini index for health. That is, United States spends a ton of money and has very bad outcomes. We have, the highest infant mortality of any developed country, et cetera. And that's because of tremendously bad distribution. 2 miles from my house in Chicago, the life expectancy is 60-something years old, 60, And if you go 5 miles in the other direction, the life expectancy is 90. It's incredible and obviously touches on social justice. So I think, it'd be nice to have more precise indices that focus just on that from my point of view, so we could compare countries more reasonably on the social justice.
Thanks.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
I think it's better if we collect the questions and then give you the floor one by one. Rene.
Okay, sorry, apologies, Alberto, for interrupting you. So very briefly, so what I was thinking when I was hearing both Alberto and Tom, so I see, so, and I want to ask perhaps Tom and also Alberto, because he was referring to this as well. So I worry that, so international law and in a way constitutional law in Latin America in the late 1990s kind of created this public law suburb, like gated community, where ambitious courts and of course judicialization, legalization of international relations, democracies trading with each other, as what Tom was referring to, celebrating treaties among each other, bringing together all this, kind of created this wonderful place, and we were all celebrating that we were sitting there, and then both domestic, and then Donald Trump came, and now this thing in Ukraine is happening, so that it's obviously illegal, but then it really shakes to the core a lot of this basic consensus that we're having. Obviously, so for instance, on the one hand, so I'm wondering whether this is something like a key moment for us to think both what was happening domestically and internationally in terms of the ambitions of the public law project all in all. So that's what got me thinking there, because both with the Ukraine invasion and with the dismantling of the basic consensus of transformative constitution in Latin America, when you talk with colleagues, we'll saying, so this can be happening. So this is something that is just beyond the pale. This is something that was completely unexpected, but it wasn't. So that's one thing. Yeah, I mean, I have other comments, but I think that would be my first reaction.
Thanks a lot, Rene. Alberto?
Thank you, Serena. And thank you, Tom, for your comment. For the paper, I'm going to check this Gini index for health and see if we can find more data. Actually, the Gini index is, because all this data, I got it from the World Bank, and I think Gini index is one of the less well recollected data in their page. So I will try to find different sources and see if I can find something better to show inequality and health. And I think it's not gonna be that difficult. And Renee, talking about like this idea of, and I think it has to be with globalization and how we look at globalization in the last years, and how the pandemic and the war shows that probably the world wasn't that global yet, and it was more of a regional phenomena that, as you say, created these spaces with different realities, and I don't like the word, but privileges. And yeah, we need to think about that. We need to think about how we are building institutions. Looking at the different presentations of today, it seems, for example, that international law is still very weak. And you said in your former presentation, in your presentation last year, that international law was for emergencies and something like that. And I agree with you that we still need to take international law more seriously if we want it to be relevant in our complexity. So I would say that.
Thank you. I think that what has been raised in this panel also connects to an underlying issue, which is connected to citizenship, and the idea that we have still and even more and more first-class and second-class citizens, so people who belong to a sort of transnational elite and enjoy more rights in terms of traveling. We were talking about this, in terms of health, in terms of participation. This is somehow, I think, at the intersection between the local and the local domestic and the international level. But I would like to leave the floor to Brian for his questions.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. Tom, I'd like to start with you. You indicate that democracies sign more treaties. Do you think that formerly autocratic regimes are trying to achieve recognition at the international level when they enter into more treaties after a transition? Or do you think that this is more due to the constitutional framework of the democracy, and whether that is kind of the sole factor behind that push to enter into more treaties?
Tom, please.
Yeah, so yes, it's true. New democracies are particularly inclined to sign treaties, particularly like human rights treaties and such, and investment treaties. And I've argued, and I think the evidence supports the idea that that's because it's a kind of commitment device, right? Let's say we have a democratic revolution, and a new leader comes in, and we all love him and believe that person. But why would we really believe that the person behind him, the next person, is going to be equally committed to democracy when we have no history of that? So locking in these policies on the international plane, it's not just a signal, it's actually raising the costs of defection, in my view. And that's consistent with the logic of this book.
Thank you. I also think that it's a sort of self-restraint and a promise for the future. And that's why many constitutions of Latin American countries and many constitutions adopted after the 80s have specific clauses opening their constitutional regime towards international law, which is something that was not so common, or not common at all, in the 50s after World War II. Brian, do you have a question for René? Shall we ask him, and also ask him the question, please, in the Q&A? I see he's already willing to reply, so.
Perfect. René, I'll start with a question I have, and then we'll move to the Q&A. Social and economic inequalities also lead to unequal political and democratic participation, as you pointed out. Is that something that the local or domestic level should be addressing? And if not, what role can international law play in that respect?
Thanks. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so two things. So the first one is, so I was actually raising my hand to react to what Sabrina and Tom were saying before. So I'll answer the question in a minute, which is, I mean, I guess that's true, but the fact that new democracies ratify more treaties doesn't necessarily signal that they comply with them. And then there's all this huge literature on, Beth Simmons kind of thing that, false positives, false negatives, and all that on human rights. So I guess there's more to be read there. So that was my comment there. Answering my question, I think that obviously, I guess that there are two levels to this, obviously. So on the one hand, you had the, again, 1990s Tom Frank kind of international rule of democracy, so top-down democracy idea. This kind of, this idea didn't go too far in terms of the multilateral system, but as Tom was mentioning, in Latin America, there's a whole apparatus of promoting democracy through international law. But interestingly, in a way, this whole democratic legal apparatus in Latin America is intergovernmental, while the human rights system is, if you want, supranational. So there is a different architecture there. And what do I read there? So I read, on the one hand, obviously there is, states, bad faith, all that, trying to not to be too regulated about that. That's true, but also what I read is that, for better or for worse, there is a very little, in a way, these are very imperfect, but very vibrant democracies, which means that civil society is not that interested either on having top-down rules on democracy. The consequence of that is that even though you have this very big supranational construct of the Inter-American system of human rights, still you have intergovernmental norms of democracy, which means that the key site is still local. Not because this is a problem, but because I would say, this is one of the features of Latin American democracy, which is you have very, very, very few fraud accusations. You have very systematic and constant elections, transitions of power, and all that. So that would be my answer. I'm sorry, yeah, but you have to understand the differences in the way it's regulated to understand how it became local.
Thank you, Renee. And I think we touched slightly onto this, but Pietro raised a question in the Q&A for you, and it says, so after rethinking the principle of equality, which could be a practical way to go against inequality, a total revolution in all points of view?
Well, a total revolution doesn't create equality, or at least that's not something that happens very often. If history has something to teach us about what happens when revolutions actually happen. But I think that the question really points to why is it so hard to make the argument about equality in Latin America. So it's really the case that redistributive politics have been the bread and butter of revolutionary politics in Latin America and left-wing guerrilla movements. That's a fact. My proposal in terms of my project, so what we're doing is what kind of vocabulary can we develop that has more substance than just formalistic arguments, legalist, but that still meaning that it is concerned with the way in which transformative constitutionalism is distributing resources within states in Latin America and among states in Latin America. That has to be also considered, without saying that or rather making it still in an incremental framework. That's basically what I'm trying to say. And to do that, kind of the first step that I suggest is tax, monetary policy, and the regulatory state. So that's kind of the first step. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Renee. I think that this brings up one of my favorite topics in constitutional law, which is solidarity. And that is one of the principles that has been put under stress so much also in Europe. It's not something that is only, you know, like an American issue, but it's a very, very European issue, both within states and between and among states of the EU. And that's why if you follow the declarations and all the statements that have been done during the COVID-19 pandemic emergency and now facing this new tragic crisis, very often solidarity is recalled. And that's a principle which is there in many of our constitutions. It's also there as one of the core values of European society in the treaties. And that's something that at the international, supranational level needs to be explored much further, I would say. But I will leave the floor to Brian for a question questions to Alberto.
Thank you. Alberto, I have one question for you. We're seeing an increasing trend in the implementation of private health systems in many countries. Do you feel that states can keep supervision and regulatory powers on these systems and in that way help provide better medical assistance, or does the privatization itself in some way limit those regulatory capabilities of the states?
That's very important what you say, Brian. I think it goes to governance because you can have a private providers, but you still need some guidelines. You still need someone who says, okay, we need to focus on this, like you guys are going to provide these services, but we still need someone who is oversighting what kind of needs we have. And I think that that's where we are lacking the most, that the regulatory organizations are not doing this job. And that's very important. I think you need, I think you need to spend public money on health. That's important. And I don't need the whole expenditure has to be public. You need to have a combination between private and public, but you need someone who is taking care of these guidelines. And we fail. I think we fail badly doing that, because if we look at, we are focused, and our focus is on personal healthcare, not in public healthcare. And that's the difference when someone is in charge of that and when they aren't.
Thanks a lot, Alberto. If there are no further questions, I would like to give the floor again to each of you for final comments, and then to Elizabeth to end this amazing panel. Tom or Alberto, would you like to say something before we? Okay, Alberto, please.
Oh, I just want to congratulate Tom because of his new published book. I find it very interesting, and I would like to read it as fast as I can. And I want to ask you, Tom, about this transformative constitutionalism that is going on in Latin America. Because René says that we need to take it seriously, and we need to give it like different dimensions. And I would like to hear your opinion, because I think that's an open discussion. An open discussion between, we can still keep going on with our traditional neo-constitutionalism, or we need to move to transformative constitutionalism.
That's a great question and a tough question. And I see it also, I think it aligns with the question in the chat from Elizabeth also. The West leaving, and where are we? You know, I think we do need to acknowledge that the, Bolivarian model was a disaster and, a failure, and obviously anti-democratic, which I thought was apparent from the very beginning. But the neoliberal model has not produced what the societies demand. And we have so many wonderful and interesting innovations from the region. I mean, as someone who studies constitutions around the world, I think of the Latin American transformative constitutionalism and, the various sort of inclusive kind of provisions that we're seeing. And a lot of the constitutional court cases, for example, in Rene's home country of Colombia. Just so, innovative. So I think there is a lot of transformative constitutionalism kind of going on, a lot of experimentation, and that's how it should be. We shouldn't just stick with old models. We have to adjust. Now, the role of China, I think, is very important because you can't really do transformative constitutionalism without dealing with political economy, right? It implicates political economy. And we often, as lawyers, want to separate the political economy. You can't do that. If you actually want transformation, you need resources to distribute. And China plays, and similar to my Belt and Road figure, plays a superficially attractive role because it's a provider of capital and no strings attached and things like this. But of course, there are risks there as well. And so perhaps if we end up in the world being a competition between the United States and China, I actually think that's good for smaller countries, honestly, because they have leverage against both and aren't dominated by either, as long as their leaders aren't too corrupt. That might end up providing windows for a more transformative constitutionalism and a more democratic one.
Thanks a lot. Elizabeth, would you like to intervene now?
Well, I'm sorry I don't want to interrupt the flow of this, but this is a fascinating panel. And just to follow up on some of my comments in the chat and also on Tom's response, when I think about China's influence in the world and in Latin America in particular, as compared to the US influence in the world in the 90s in particular, right, in terms of spreading democracy and globalism, it makes me wonder about this sort of divide between the political economy, so the political future versus sort of the economic. So the US and China are somewhat aligned on the economic side, which is good for developing countries. So you see China sort of investing a lot more in Latin America and so forth. But then there's a political divide in terms of how to approach democracies and so forth. And one of the things that has struck me from this panel is how important constitutions are to sort of make that link to how we're going to shape international law moving forward, right? So sort of the movement from the United States and Europe to sort of liberalize the world and push treaties and so forth into Latin America, that benefited Latin America as it moved out of the Cold War, as we moved out of the Cold War era, and the Americans sort of developed these constitutions that incorporated international law principles that reflected that political sort of dominant narrative. But now there's a different political dominant narrative, which is what's so fascinating about Tom's book, which is concerning. And yet on the economic side, it's very global, right? It's very globalized. And so I don't know if I really have a question about that, but I guess it's just sort of a comment and sort of thinking about sort of new frameworks moving forward and the real need to honor our domestic constitutions. Because once that sort of starts to collapse, then we run the risk of the international law frameworks also running awry in terms of noncompliance with treaties that are already established, or creation of new treaties with very different sort of political orientations.
You're completely right. In many cases, the breaching upon constitutions is just the first step, and then some countries try to get out of their international commitments with the same spirit. I don't know if Tom wishes to react, and then I will give the floor to Rene.
I mean, I do agree completely. And, obviously this threat of backsliding implicates this choice. So stronger constitutional frameworks in which there's participation, in which some redistribution can happen. In a global context, those things don't constrain innovation. They actually allow it and facilitate, in my view. So I think it's a great.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Rene? Alberto, don't worry. I will give you the floor later. You have it.
Thank you.
It's all right.
No, just very briefly. So, I think that the China dimension, I'm going to be very brief on this, really what does push is it really forces us to reconsider what role constitutions play in Latin America, in the sense that, so what I have been observing really is that, so, I mean, I agree. So this kind of economic competition between the US, China, also up to a point, Europe, what does is it creates these different partners, but then this is not, so this investment, for instance, creates regulatory patterns. And then these regulatory patterns, they compete within states in Latin America among themselves, meaning investment, for instance, Chinese investment in ports, that meaning ports or roads or whatever, they bring their own regulation, their own contracts, their own way of doing things, their own law in a way. Then obviously we have a whole tradition of investment based or inspired by US law through the World Bank and US investors. So when you have that, then what you have then is two, in a way, overall two competing regulatory projects, and then the Constitution and the regulatory and, you know, national regulatory agencies, constitutional adjudicators and all that, what they do is they have to manage these two competing regulatory, literally like fields in the Bourdieusian sense. They have these two senses, and then they manage. So it's in a way, so in a way, it requires a redefinition of what courts do, because if they don't pay attention to these dimensions, it will be impossible for them to enforce, because obviously they don't have that much power anymore as compared to these very strong investors and all that. So I think that's what I'm observing. I don't know what to do with that observation, but that's actually what I'm observing. So I just wanted to say that.
Thanks, but acknowledging the problem is the first phase of understanding how to face problems. So, of course.
Or perhaps it's not a problem, it's an opportunity, it's a redefinition.
Yeah. Alberto?
Thank you, Sabrina. I would like to go back to 19th century and see that, yeah, because the problem is that our country has been exist in the world for the last 500 years, and our continent, sorry, and the history of most of this time has been to separate and try to build our own existence out of the rest of the powers in the world. And after 19th century, I think we reached some kind of independence, and then after World War II, in the Cold War era, we again face some kind of struggle between European powers and American powers in a socialist versus capitalist fight. But and during globalization, we changed that, and we thought the world as one, and we thought that we could forget about the past and just go with the idea that the world could be one. And I'm not sure that's gonna be our thinking in the next years. I think the next years we are gonna be less friendly with other regions in the world, and I'm not sure that I'm not sure that the continent is going to be widely open to exchange with the rest of the world. And so in that way, well, we will see. But I think the friendly years of globalization are over. That something different is coming. And we will see how the continent relates to other parts of the world in that new arrangement. I think especially the Russia-Ukrainian war is going to be important to have in.
Thanks a lot, Alberto. This is less optimistic than your wishes at the end of the talk. I would like to thank Tom, Renee, and you for the great talks and the great questions you asked each other and the great answers, all the participants. And I will leave the floor to Elizabeth for the conclusion of the panel. And the webinar.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you all for this really riveting discussion. There's one last question in the chat I'll just mention in the Q&A, which is, what is your opinion on to take inequality as a normative commitment? And I don't know if anyone can really have a good answer to that. I mean, it's clearly an important endeavor, right? And Renee, I can definitely let you answer that if you'd like. But before we go, I do want to thank Sabrina. I want to thank all of you. We clearly, what I have gotten from both of the roundtables is that we are in a new era. And sometimes I feel like I'm living my great grandmother's life, maybe at 1918 or something like that all over again. And sometimes I look at the news and I wonder why in the world, how are we here after working so hard post 1945 to build these global institutions and rule of law and so forth. And so, but I think the important thing is that we are all searching for answers, that we have all acknowledged, as Sabrina said, the problems, the challenges. And I think also having this perspective that it's not just global, it's also very local. The solutions are local, the problems are global, and sort of trying to understand that how this all fits together. But also, I think from this panel in particular, what was very insightful was we have to understand these things with data and with detail, right? So solutions are also very much data and science driven as well as sectorial, right? So we can talk about that, the trade or the big picture overlaps dialogue, which I particularly love, but we also have to delve into the detail to really understand how do we make that normative commitment towards inequality and including that, and how does that work in health, and how does that work in other aspects of our society. And just finally, with respect to the Americas, which I'm really glad that, Alberto, I appreciate your addressing this from the entire Americas, right, North and South, because GLAPA is really dedicated to sort of thinking about global policy from that perspective, from the entire continent. But it's also important to remember that each country is different, and Latin America in itself is a project, right? So what's the constitutional transformations that are happening in some countries, there definitely is some backsliding in others, right? So I think it's important to sort of make those distinctions as well. And I don't think that the United States is necessarily an exception. And so we have had a very strong and wonderful constitutional democracy for a long time, and we need to continue to defend that and respect that, because clearly it impacts also international law. So Renee, I don't know if you wanted to say a couple of comments regarding the question.
I mean, I think it's a crucially important question, but I mean, obviously, I think we're on our way out. I wouldn't want to keep people, and you're closing. Yeah, so I'll let you close.
Okay, so thank you, Renee. Thank you, everyone. As I mentioned before, at the end of the last round table, the building you see in my virtual background is the new law school for the University of Houston Law Center. And hopefully, as we enter toward the end of this pandemic, we can invite you all in person to see the law school and to have another chat and discussion in person at the new law school. Thank you all. Thank you to the Houston Journal of International Law, who will be in touch with you all about the papers. So everyone participating, be in lookout for that publication in the fall that will bring together both last year's seminars and this seminar. But it doesn't end here, right? We have to continue with our research and our projects. And so I thank all of you for being here. Be well, and may we all have a better future. We must stay positive. And thank you, Sabrina, and thank you to the University of Bologna as well.
And goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.